Welcome to Leadership for Society, Reimagining Work Post-COVID. I'm Brian Lowry, and today we're talking about education, citizens and workers, education and capitalist democracy. And I'm really excited to talk to two distinguished guests, Rachel Carlson, the co-founder and CEO of Guild Education. Rachel is obviously the co-founder and CEO of Guild, and their company is on a mission to unlock opportunity for America's workforce through education and upskilling. And I'm also talking to David Osborne. David is the author or co-author of 6 nonfiction books, including Reinventing America's Schools, Creating a 21st Century School System, and Reinventing Government, a New York Times bestseller in 1992. So thanks for coming.
Thanks for having us.
Great. So I'm just going to jump right in. As we think about reimagining work post-COVID, we have to think about education and training, right? So to have a healthy economy, to have a well-functioning society, we have to train people to be able to do jobs and also to engage in democracy in a compelling and competent way. So the question I have for you two is, how do you think about the function of education in our society? Where do you place the emphasis? So David, I'll start with you.
Well, that's a subject of a lot of dispute in American society. People have different views about that. The way I look at it, education has 2 big missions. One is to help everyone develop in a way that they can live their own life to the fullest, to realize their fullest potential. And the other is to help them develop the skills and knowledge to be successful in a modern economy. So I think it's those 2 things are there are other things we need from education as well. It would be really nice if the schools were preparing people to be productive citizens in a democracy. They often fail on that score, as we've seen in recent years. But I think those are the 2 that I emphasize.
Rachel, what about you?
Yeah, my views on this have changed quite a bit. I joke that I was sort of born on third base. I was grateful to go to Stanford undergrad, but I'm a legacy and make no illusions about the fact that I'm clear why I got the leg up. I stood on shoulders, right? And so I really thought it was more about, I'll call it some of the broader debates that happen tied to the educated civic population and self-actualization. I've actually been able to see a path through a lot of that debate now, which is, and much to how David described it, I think if we view education as a bit more like a Maslow's hierarchy of needs, there's a ground floor that we have to provide to people. And that ground floor has to start with the ability to provide for my family or know that I one day will be able to provide for my family. And that's so rooted in the American ethos. And the next level is I want to do better than my parents did, right? That's the second part of the American ethos of how we think about the American dream and doing better, and being more capable or ability to have more flexibility or the middle-class family sustaining wage. Then above that, what happens is people who, after they solve for those 2 things, which makes all the sense in the world from a Maslow's perspective, well, then they want to learn more to think about how can they be an engaged citizen? How can they be a contributing member of their community? You see people then return to and really embrace a lifelong learning perspective. So that's my worldview today.
Got it.
It's a nice way to put it.
Yeah, no, that is a really compelling way to put it, which makes me think of something though. I'm impressed that you are willing to say, hey, I was a legacy. I don't have any illusions around that. I think that's often an uncomfortable thing to say. And I wonder what it makes you think about education as a way to maintain things as they are, right? So we typically think about education as a way to improve the functioning of society. I wonder, as you, given that comment, if you think about how it might actually maintain things as they are.
Oh man, yeah, we'll go deep early because I have a lot of feelings about this. I spend my day-to-day helping America's frontline workers have access to education. So I obviously spend a lot of my time trying to disrupt the barriers that I'd argue are heavily oriented around maintenance. But I think part of the important thing to acknowledge, though, is that nobody's trying to do wrong. I spent a couple of years really deep in the community college system. And what I saw there was, our community colleges have an average graduation rate of 8 to 20%, depending on the school and how you slice the data. But I never met a bad person working at one of those schools. I met people who were deeply dedicated to the mission and the work. The problem is we built those schools for a mission in the 50s and 60s, which was sending our young men to school after a war and creating purpose and meaning for that crowd tied to an economic need then. So there's an example. And then, and I think we don't talk enough about that one. And then I'll jump right into the hotbed that the New York Times would, write a story about every day if they could, which is, the preservation of different types of privilege. What bothered me a lot in my year working in admissions, and by the way, I'm a proud Stanford alum, I should say that. And I think we need to keep changing, right? In my year working in Stanford admissions, it was frustrating to see that there were some elements of diversity that the school was able to push boundaries on, and others which had financial implications, including welcoming in more folks from the community college system or just 18-year-olds from low-income backgrounds, that was a harder choice to make when you looked at the aggregate data. And so I think there is a lot of maintenance of an outdated higher ed system, maintenance of privilege. And we gotta change that if we want to have a united citizenship. Back to the goal. If education wants to be productive towards the ends of united citizenship, I think the root of our populism right now is really, really connected to some of the flaws of our education system.
Mm-hmm. I like that you referenced the creation of the community college system in part in response to the needs associated with bringing soldiers back from the war. And I'd like to think about what the pandemic, so these major events in history shift or can shift how the society functions. And so as we think about the pandemic, what have we learned about what we need in terms of education and training? What has it revealed maybe that was there that we weren't paying enough attention to? And David, I'll go to you with that.
Yeah, I think it's been incredibly revealing. I think a lot of parents in particular were shocked first by how rigid their school systems were and how difficult it was for them to adjust when the world changed and suddenly they had to go remote. And then by the low quality of the education their children were getting when they were remote. The community college system may have been built for the 1950s and 1960s, but the K-12 system was built for the 1910s and 20s. It was really built as an industrial economy emerged. And, the model, it was built on the modern model at the time, which was called bureaucracy. These top-down, hierarchical, large, centralized bureaucracies. And in the public sector, they had monopoly status. They were built to be very stable, to give you the same thing this year you got last year, and the year before, and the year before that. And they're very hard to change. In the 50s and 60s and 70s, they unionized in most of America, and that made them even more rigid. And so now I think people have realized, my goodness, we need schools that can change and that can use technology, and we don't have them. We have a system that is almost incapable of change. On top of that, people realized, our kids are all different and they need to, some of them thrive in remote online education, and some of them, it doesn't work at all. Some of them need the social interaction. And so all kinds of families began trying to create pods, and micro schools grew up, and all kinds of alternatives, because we need choices for different kids. And when you have a monolithic system that kind of treats all the kids the same and batch processes them like they're on an assembly line, people are finally waking up to realize that doesn't work. So I hope it's some kind of turning point.
Brian, if I could add on that, in the higher ed space, we saw the most fascinating segmentation of two things that people had bundled into one for a long time, right? What is college? And what we saw was that people who were hiring, I like to think of the student as a consumer, people who were hiring college for a coming of age experience were devastated, right? There was no social emotional learning, the dorm experience, learning how to become an adult, all those things that are really intrinsic for the 27% of American learners who ever spend a night in a dorm. For the other 73%, it was so empowering. Suddenly they didn't have to take the bus to get to a local campus in order to sit in front of a faculty member who spoke for an hour and a half and then try and get their way home or organize that around their work schedule. Suddenly there was this blossoming of what they were hiring college for, which was skills acquisition. And so I think that's been something that's been really, really fascinating, as we're in the same way that K-12 is getting to have a conversation about, well, what does the student need from this system? We're finding that folks over the age of 22 are saying, wow, college suddenly started being more what I wanted college to be.
Mm-hmm. And so the barriers that you pointed out, I think, in my understanding, is that Guild is in part an attempt to get beyond some of those barriers for people beyond, working age people. Can you tell us a little bit about your thinking about that in Guild, how it works in Guild?
Yeah, so our focus demographic are the 100 million Americans for whom we believe, and the labor data tells us, are going to need to reskill or upskill in the next 10 years in order to remain employable. And ideally, if we do our jobs, have a really good chance at a stable family sustaining wage and career. And so the way we go about that is aiming to work with about 300 of the 7,500 schools in the US that we've found have high quality, low cost outcomes for working adults. I wish that number was bigger, but 300 is enough, and they're growing. So we work with those schools to help any employee at companies that we partner with, like Chipotle or Discover Financial or Lowe's or Disney, you name it, but mostly frontline workers across the US, to figure out what are their skills today, what do they want out of their career path in the future, a conversation many have never had the privilege of having. Then what skills do they then need to acquire to get on that path? And 50% of that time, the answer is getting into a degree program. But 50% of the time, it's things like certificates in digital marketing for people who've been in analog marketing frontline jobs for a long time, or helping people move from being, I'm a data entry associate, to actually becoming a data analyst. Or actually, the biggest one is people management. The fastest path to the middle class right now is teaching someone how to lead other people. So a lot of short-term kind of 6 to 12-month programs. And then we just give them a coach and advisor all the way through, which is the core insight we had coming out of the community college system, was that the best thing you can do is pair someone with a coach. Got it.
And so there seems to be working with the businesses to make this happen. And I always, one of the things that I'm really interested in is the respective role of business and government in providing things like education, right? So a big social need. Should business be such a big player in this space?
I can argue both ways. So I'll tell you my thoughts. The fun thing is that Guild was my graduate school research project. So I've looked at it from every angle, and I've sort of maybe annoyed my investors from time to time for doing this, but I can criticize it as well as I can support it. I think that on one angle, the body was the unit of production for a really long time. And that's what got us focused on making sure that employers were caring for people's physicality and their bodies. Now, I think that went too far when we said, should employers be the only place where people get healthcare, right? But I do believe employers should care about their workers' physicality when that was the unit of production. Today, the unit of production is the brain, right? We're in a knowledge economy. And so I think it makes a ton of sense for employers to have a voice in saying, here's what the future of work looks like. And we have both data self-sourced from university presidents who say they trust employers more now to say what the future of work looks like than they can figure out at their own school. But more importantly, average American now would trust their CEO more than their local college president to tell them what skills they need 10 years from now. So that's the role. That's the role of informing and giving influence on the learning, which I'm very supportive of. When it comes to funding, we're vehemently anti-student debt at Guild. And so the path to avoiding that has been having employers pay. I like a world where employers and the federal government pay. And I don't think we're paying enough out of the federal government. So I think that's where, if the world changes, Guild will be very happy to adapt.
Great. I don't know, David, if you have any thoughts about this. I mean, I know that you think a lot about schools. I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Well, I think the reality is that business does have a huge role in education, broadly defined. If you think about the training and education that people get post-college or post-high school, if they don't go to college, who provides most of it? Businesses to their employees. And, people in government tend to think about, well, we should have this program and we should have that program. And there are something like 50 different programs funded by the federal government, most of them small. But what they really should be thinking about is most of the money is spent by business. And our role should be to give people the information they need about the quality of different providers so that they can make better decisions about buying training or education. And then, as Rachel said, providing funds for individuals, workers, and those who want to be in the workforce so that they can access quality training and education, because low-income people don't have access to those resources. So, we have to understand that there's a market for education and training, and most of the providers are businesses, and that's the world we live in. So let's figure out how to make it work better for people.
Yeah, I'm really interested in how we make it work better, because Rachel, you pointed out that healthcare is tied to employment in part, as you described it, because the body was the unit of production, right? And what do we really want to go to a world where we have the same kind of thing for knowledge? Like, I don't know. Like, I'm not sure that sounds like a better world than the world we're in now. So how do you avoid getting to a place where education is incredibly tied up in private industry as opposed to something that society takes care of across the lifespan?
So I think about it the way our students talk about it. So I got to walk into Stanford with a bunch of AP credits because I went to a high school system and I followed the traditional path. But our average student is in their 30s, often a woman, often a mom, often a woman of color. And she has often received enormous amount of training at her company. And yet our higher ed system kind of puts its nose up to that learning that she's done over often, call it 10 to 14 years. Whereas I had good high school teachers, but let's be honest, like, did I really have 12 credits of college learning the day I walked into Stanford? I don't think so. But we honor it, right? So we create systems that honor one population, and it's typically populations that follow the traditional norm, which then doubles down on privilege and eliminates access. So I think what higher ed needs to do is open up the doors to honoring more learning. The uncomfortable truth in that is that it's problematic for higher ed's revenue model, because higher ed today has very high cost of acquisition, very, very high. The top 100 don't, but the other 7,400 schools in the US pay a tremendous amount to Google and Facebook and digital marketing to attract their students. And then they have to receive enough revenue on the back end to make that investment worth it. So short-term programs are very threatening to universities, but also so is giving away credits for free. Now, again, elite schools can do it, but we've not said we would honor the learning that happens on the job. And I think business wants that. And I think higher ed is resisting that.
Mm-hmm. Great. So I want to shift a little bit from higher ed and think about primary school. So as I assume many of you listening know, and I'm sure Rachel and David, that there are huge disparities in outcomes certainly among dimensions of race, but class as well, in terms of educational achievement, reading, math. And then we also see across all different demographic groups, as someone pointed out, a stunning and dismaying consistency in misinformation around civic education. Like, our citizenry just does not understand how our government functions. Why is this? Like, what do you think is causing the failure? And David, I'll go to you. And I know you've already talked about how it's an old system, but the old system was designed to teach people to read and write and math, and we're failing at that too. So what do you think is going on here?
Yeah, I think that we created this system, which, as I said, is very stable. And, schools today are not all that different from they were when I was going to school 50 years ago. They assume that students come to school motivated, and then the teachers will provide knowledge to them. And that still works in a lot of middle and upper middle class communities, because many of those students do come to school motivated, and they manage to get an education. But in the inner city and in some rural areas with really low income kids, you can't make that assumption. They may not even come to school speaking English. They may grow up in a neighborhood where they don't know anyone except their teachers who ever went to college. And it's never occurred to them that they would ever go to college. And so what happens is they do okay through elementary school typically, but then you hit middle school and you start introducing abstractions and asking them to learn things like algebra. And why would you ever learn algebra unless you saw it as a step toward college or a step toward a career? And if they don't see that, the motivation isn't there, and they fall off the conveyor belt, and you see high dropout rates and so on. We need schools that meet those kids where they are. The first job is to create motivation. It's interesting, we've created a innovation sector in public education called charter schools, and they work well in some places and not as well in others. A lot depends on the state law that governs them. And a lot depends on whether they're authorized by a school district or a state board or a university. But where they work well, when you visit one of these schools, they'll immediately tell you, yeah, on day one, our job is motivation. We bring the kids in, let's say we're a high school, we bring them in ninth grade for 2 weeks before school starts. And it's all focused on building motivation, building expectations. Then we tailor to where they are. We don't just give them the classic ninth grade curriculum. And if they're ready for it, great. And if they're not, too bad. We meet them where they are. We provide tutors if they need to catch up. We provide extra time in the summer and during breaks if they need to catch up. The cliche has become personalization, but we really do need to go from batch processing to personalizing education and helping each student go from where they are when they get to school to where they need to be. And the old system can't do it. It's just impossible. It's so rule-driven and so rigid, and so built really for the convenience of the adults, not for the needs of the children, that we need fundamental change in how that system operates.
And Rachel, I know this is not your space, but I'm just curious if you have thoughts. I know again, you spend a lot of time thinking about education. What do you see as a possibility in terms of improving outcomes?
Yeah, I can't profess to be an expert. I kind of sit on the barbells because I spend my time in higher ed, and then we run a preschool daycare at Guild. So I spend a lot of time thinking about innovation in childcare, which, by the way, that's another mess for another day. It's worse than K-12 on a bad day. But in the K-12 space, I think one of the things we've lost our way on, especially amidst the movement to send everybody to college, which I'm culturally very supportive of. I think we have to define what college means, but I'm culturally supportive of where that came from and the moving away from a culture that tracked people based on race and socioeconomic background. But when we shifted to this world of where about 10% of Americans went to college to where that was supposed to be the aspiration for everyone, what we forgot to say was, okay, so how do we want to measure that? And we got really obsessed with basically the memorization of content, right? Like so much of our K-12 system is around trying to get you to memorize and accumulate knowledge. But we have computers. And I'm pretty sure my kids are going to use a search engine and a calculator 3x more than I did and 30x more than their grandparents did. So I'm pretty sure for my kids, the measurement is going to be, do they love learning and do they love it enough to constantly contextualize the knowledge they're learning? And I don't think any of those tests that can measure whether they've memorized anything are really going to matter. And I'd probably fail my 7th grade algebra quiz if I retook it right now, but I was able to build on top of that learning to do the things I do today. And we kind of have to reset. I just think we have to reset the conversation, because to do the social emotional learning, to care for people, to do what actually I think some of the system did better, believe it or not, in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, not for everyone by a long stretch, but what the system did well for at least the middle class white male was not about memorizing content. It was about providing a platform to become the type of adult society wanted you to become.
And so these are all great aspirations, but as you both know better than almost anyone, there are a lot of barriers to making these changes. And I'm going to come back to something that you said earlier, David, that unions you mentioned as one barrier to change. And that's actually is a big part of the conversation when we talk about education. Teachers' unions are particularly powerful, but they also are a way, presumably, to protect labor. Right. So our teachers aren't paid very well. And I looked at a 2013 study that suggested that charter school teachers are paid less than traditional public school teachers. So as you think about making these kind of changes, what do you tell that workforce, the current teachers, primary, secondary school, about what they can expect from these changes?
Well, I think that that in many ways, the teachers are the most disillusioned part of this whole picture. Teachers in public school systems, Gallup does a survey. It's done it millions of times for all kinds of businesses and professions. I think there are about a dozen professions that they've surveyed. And one of the questions, it's 20 questions or 16 questions. One of the questions is, I feel that my voice, my opinions matter at work most of the time. And of all those professions, education is the highest in saying no to that. Teachers, public school teachers, feel like that they're at the bottom of the barrel, and they have outside their school classroom, they have little authority, they have no control over sort of the direction of the school. And their complaints sort of boil down to, they treat us like children. We need to make education a profession. And in a profession, you have some role in helping to manage, helping to run the institution. We unionized, the teachers unionized for good reasons back in the 60s and 70s. It was needed. Women in particular were just treated terribly. You get, back in the 50s, if you got pregnant as a teacher, you were out. So we needed all of those changes. But now we need to move away from a model that's built on an industrial workforce, management versus labor, to a more professional model where the teachers are part of the team that runs the school. And that's a tough shift. It's happening. There are about 150 teacher-run public schools in this country, about half of them charter, half of them district. And they're growing slowly. But all of the status quo, all of the forces that preserve the status quo in K-12 education stand in the way of that. And one of them is teachers' unions. They actually don't want teachers treated like professionals. They don't want teachers to be able to move from school to school as they choose. They want districts preserved as they are, to preserve the protections that teachers have. For example, the fact that after the first 2 or 3 years, it's almost impossible to fire them. I mean, that's very important to the teachers' unions. And that that creates so much rigidity in the system and undermines the ability to make schools improve year after year after year.
My mom was a school teacher, by the way, and she was quite frustrated, as most primary school teachers are and can be. But I think she also appreciated the protections, right? So I think there's a lot of distrust in the people who are making decisions about how resources are expended. And the union is a way to have voice, right? It's obviously a collective voice. I wonder, how do you change the system such that you maintain, like, I hear you saying that they should be treated like professionals, they should have a role in running things. That is not at all, I would argue, how it currently functions.
Right, right.
And so if you get rid of unions prior to making that change, right, then you put teachers at risk. So I just wonder, how do you think about that chicken and egg problem?
We need to preserve certain protections. So, for example, if you're in a school district, you should be protected from the whim of an administrator firing you, right? There should be due process. There should be a process. When I was a consultant, our firm actually was hired to run the Minneapolis school system for 3.5 years back in the 1990s. They actually wanted to hire our president, but he wouldn't leave the company he'd just founded. And so they hired the company. And one thing that he and his colleagues managed to do was work with the union in Minneapolis to develop a teacher-run system to weeding out teachers who shouldn't be in the classroom. We can do that. It means modifying the tenure system, not eliminating it completely. The same with, if we change our school system so that principals and their teachers have more power to actually operate the school and change the learning model to meet the needs of the kids who've shown up at that school, then teachers need more. Some teachers won't fit this school or that. Let's say this school decides to become a dual language immersion school because there's a lot of Spanish speaking kids, and it's far more effective in that environment. Well, some teachers won't speak Spanish, and they'll lose their job at that school. But a district can say, you're not going to lose your job. We're going to let you choose a place at a school that will fit you better with a principal who wants you, but is not a dual language immersion school. So there are ways we can create more flexible systems while continuing some legitimate and very fair and common sense protections for teachers. And frankly, teachers welcome that. They are very frustrated if you read any of the surveys.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think there's not a lot of disagreement with that. It's frustrating being a teacher these days, for sure. I want to kind of shift back to thinking on the student side and the later stage in life. We don't have a lot of, in this country, vocational training. And so this is obviously going to be for you, Rachel. Mm-hmm. And by vocational training, I don't mean like what people think of as like plumbers or electricians, the kind of basic trades, but I mean vocational training that could be even like tech and engineering. Like we have a university system, and then people go out and often really learn what they need to do at the job, right? That is a common, I think, experience. How do we address the historic inequities in that kind of training? And for you, Rachel, so I think now people say, oh, it's a pipeline issue, but the reality is when the great jobs were factory jobs, there were still racial and gender inequities then too, right? So it's not as if these inequities are new because we've now moved to this knowledge economy. The inequities that we have now are the same inequities we had before in terms of access to the best paying jobs. And so as you think about what you're doing, the way you're trying to upskill and prepare people for these an array of jobs, how do you address that historic inequity that continues?
Yeah. So at one level, just to because this is a philosophical environment, I feel like I can go dork on history here. Part of why America has fewer, I'll call it technical and vocational, right? Because we called it technical schools until we started using tech for another word, is we have a really heterogeneous economy. And that's actually great. Right. So where you look at the countries that have really successful apprenticeship and technical trainings, whether that's moving people into what's called the historical trades, which I'm really passionate about, or moving people into, let's call it the 21st century technical trades. Companies doing that well have really homogeneous economies. And so the government and business tend to align on like, okay, what are our 5 things? Like there are countries in Europe who are like, we're a car manufacturing country. And others who are like, we make cheese and chocolate, right? Like that's actually a thing. America, for good, it's part of why our GDP grows. We're heterogeneous. So if you're going to then try and do something that creates the opportunity, what we used to do is we did it regionally, and the US had a very regional economy for horrible reasons, mostly connected to slavery and then the way we grew. But now we have a national heterogeneous economy. So you have to start there when you're talking to anyone who lives anywhere in the US. They don't want to feel constrained to what their pathways can be based on the region they grew up in, or to your question, their background. So then the next question we often talk a lot about is, okay, how do we actually do this in the right order? And my main thing that I think we need to do is that we need to actually flip the order of learning. Today we say, oh, go get your general studies, go learn about critical thinking and all these things. And then we'll teach you some technical skills, maybe in your senior year, or better yet, I'll pick on Stanford for a second here. We don't have a business degree. If you want that, you come back for graduate school. and hook, line, and sinker, I did it. But that's a problem. I think we should teach people the technical skills first. That allows them to enter the workforce. And we need to recognize that we're now in a lifelong learning economy. And how do we stack the learning on? And if you change that conversation, you suddenly open the door to acquiring those technical skills to people in a lot more equitable ways. And so what I say a lot is like, why do you have to go to college to get a job? Why can't you get a job, learn, and then decide what you want to do in college?
All right, that is a very different system.
There you go. You nodded when I said, "Can I go philosophical?" So
yeah, of course. No, I love that.
And
go ahead, David.
Our government funding has to shift as well. You know,
yes.
we're stuck in this, exactly what Rachel said, this mindset that you go to college. Well, so even our most progressive leaders, like Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, they're all for free college. But what percent of Americans go to college? What percent of Americans stay in college for 4 years? It's a minority. Most Americans don't. So you're leaving them out. You're going to spend all this money on people who are already a little bit privileged. I have proposed, not that anyone's listening, but we should take that money, and why don't we say anybody who's has an income today of less than $80,000 a year, let's give them an account, a lifelong learning account. Let's start with $10,000, and maybe we'll have a sliding scale, and maybe it'll be at 80,000, it'll be 5,000, and down to when you make 70,000, it'll be 10,000. I mean, so it phases out slowly. But the point is, let's give everybody resources that they can use. And if they want to use that to go to community college, great. If they want to use that to help pay for a 4-year college, great. But if they're already in the workforce and they know they need certain skills, fine, go at night and get a certificate, or use the money how you need it to improve your skills and your education at your point of life. And let's make it available for the bottom half of our income scale, not the top half.
All right, so you got to jump on my last question. So I'll go with Rachel and see if you have something else you want to add. But this whole series is about reimagining work. So what would you do if you could reimagine the way education functions in work? What would be your primary focus? What would you like to change?
Yeah, so David hit it, but the 4 and 40 is dead, right? Going to college for 4 years and then going to work for 40 and then retiring, dead. I think we're entering what I call like the every 4, which is that we're going to work, and every 4 to 5 years, we're going to need to pick our heads up and either reskill, meaning prepare for our next job, or upskill, get better at today's job that we're in. And what the data tells us is that white people who start in their career in the white collar economy earlier are going to do more upskilling. And unfortunately, people who live in the lower half of the economy are going to need to reskill more, which is actually more expensive, right? Learning a wholly new job. And so I would love to see our funding infrastructure, as well as our conversation around higher ed, and then most importantly, our higher ed entities, and some are already doing this, reorient their business models and their ways of teaching and their ways of working to serve the every 4 economy.
Great. And David, you have the last word. What would you want to leave us with?
Well, going back to K-12 for a minute, I mean, your question about what would you change? I think we need a K-12 system in which we have the people who run schools actually are empowered to run schools rather than the central office making all the hiring and firing decisions and spending decisions. And those schools being allowed and encouraged to diversify their learning models, particularly in urban areas where geography is on your side. Families actually have choices in terms of the schools they can get to, so that there are Montessori schools and there are STEM schools and there are performing arts schools and there are dual language immersion schools and on and on and on. And give the families choices so that they can find the school that best fits their child. And then hold the schools accountable. If the kids are learning and the parents are happy and the kids are happy, great. That school gets to keep going, might even be invited to create another school to replicate. But if the parents are gradually drifting away, taking their kids out, and the test scores are bad, and the parent surveys and student surveys tell you that it's an unhappy place, well, that school should be replaced by a team that can do better in that building. So actual accountability for performance. I think that's the kind of 21st century system that works. And we know it works because we have it in some places, like New Orleans, which is all charter now, and like Washington, D.C., which is half charter now. And Denver, where Rachel is, which has a lot of charter schools and a lot of innovation schools within the district. Our districts are beginning to put their toes in that water, but it's awfully slow and we need more of it.
All right, great, thanks. Well, I hope we see some of those changes. We are in desperate need of some improvements, as you both pointed out. So thank you so much for talking with me. Next week, we'll discuss the ways that work controls our lives, and we'll be joined by Karen Arnold, Head of Talent Acquisition at Automatic, a company that has always been fully remote. Thank you both again, and that's it for this session.
Thank you, Brian.
Thanks, Brian.